Hey folks, I figured I would take a moment and jump onto Facebook Live and do a quick post about the UN. It came up in conversation in some threads as a result of the post the other day on Israel and the UN and Trump and Obama. So there's a larger conversation to be had that's well in line with what I'm hoping to talk about in Herdwatching. And you'll have to pardon me if the audio is not perfect. I can put my lapel mic on. I'm shooting this on my iPhone. Whatever. I don't have the studio, quote unquote, set up for anything more specific, but I wanted to get out there and really talk about this right away. So, obviously, the UN has condemned Israel more than once for what Israel is doing. And when people talk about this, they tend to use words like illegal or against international law or, whatever. And the general idea is that the UN has some authority that should be respected when they, tell Israel to stop doing something or whatever. And we need to talk about this idea of governmental authority, both on our own level and where the UN is. And it's a large and complicated topic because it gets to the ethics of social contracts and whatever. But in a nutshell, what I believe is this: governments do not have a natural inherent authority. And so, in other words, there are some things that I consider to be natural, ethical, and moral foundational concepts. The right to self, that you have the right to defend your own life, I consider to be a natural and inherent baseline concept in existence. Obviously, it doesn't come from the universe in the sense that it's not embodied in physics or whatever, but it is embodied in the fact that I have, my mind controls my body will act in its own defense. I have a natural right to defend myself. I have an authority to make that decision for myself. The authority to think what you choose to think, or the natural right to do that. The language it's easy to get bogged down in terminology and language, and different people define these things different ways. So we're just going to talk about that. So, in other words, there are these things that I consider to be the natural authorities of the universe, the base moral concepts. Those are, generally speaking, about you and your control over your internal headspace in your body. Everything past that, generally speaking, comes by agreement. Now, you take a governing body like the United States, or any government, societal level government. The fact that I was born in the United States puts me under the practical authority of the United States government. And as I grew up, because they have guns and they have the police and they have the ability to compel me to go to jail or be subject to violence. So I'm under their authority. But it wasn't until I learned more about that government and learned more about the society I'd been born into that I became complicit in that authority. I decided that I was going to accept, to an extent, the authority of that government. In other words, I wasn't just going to be compelled to obedience, but that we were on board with this. And that was my acceptance of that part of that social contract. But that's always provisional. If this government turns out to lose its mind and go crazy and start acting in ways that I consider to be antithetical to my ethics or my morals, then I don't feel like I owe it my obedience and allegiance at that point. So people use the word social contract a lot when they're talking about taxes and roads and whatever, but the core social contract is really that you are either complicit in your relationship with your government, i.e. you feel that your government is acting in a way that you actively support, or you're simply subject to the authority of your government through threat of force or incarceration, even though that threat may never come up. You may never be in conflict enough with that. Again, you're either actively complicit or you're simply subject to that authority. Now, the UN, to the extent that it has any legitimacy as a governing body at all, it does not have the physical power in itself to compel obedience. It has no standing army. it owns no territory, it has no natural population. So any authority the UN has is simply by the consent of the members of the UN. So when Israel's a member of the UN, which means it has to some degree made an agreement to allow itself to be bound by the decisions of the UN. That conferred between Israel and the UN a certain level of authority to the UN. It ceded a certain level of authority. But as with all active contracts that way, as with all things, the responsibilities of the UN back to Israel or any member state would have been to act in a reasonable way, in a way that was somehow or another consistent with sort of the morals and ethics and rationale of that body. And this is where the UN starts to fail as a practical matter. So let's say the UN, as has happened, condemned the Soviet Union for taking actions that the Soviet Union felt was completely within its self-interest and necessary for its survival. The Soviet Union ignored those or pushed back against them, or it certainly didn't simply roll over and say, oh, well, the UN and a whole bunch of other nations said it must be true. We're going to give up our ability to make a sovereign decision for our own future, and we're simply going to accept the judgment of the UN on something that we consider to be critical to our survival. That's not the way that happened. And it's been that way with a lot of other nations. Now, some nations defy the UN, and the member states of the UN agree amongst themselves that it's important enough to bring them into compliance that they would use physical force to compel that obedience. And in those circumstances, to me, that's not a matter of the UN expressing a legal or natural authority. It's simply a bunch of nations getting together and agreeing among themselves to use force to impose their will on another nation. The UN may have organized that. The UN may have helped those treaty discussions. But it's not like, I don't know how to explain that any better. The UN doesn't actually have an inherent natural legal authority. Just because the UN says something is legal or illegal doesn't make it so. It's only when you agree to be under the UN and to continue to agree that their actions are reasonable that you accept the concept of the UN being able to declare something moral and ethical, legal or not legal. Past that, you're simply subject to whatever force the UN can bring to bear. And this is why this is a critical distinction. This is not simply academic. One of the reasons why it's such a problem when the United States or another country has a president or a leadership that is sort of cheerfully diving into this idea that they want the UN to be a meta authority, that they're dying to cede sovereignty to the UN. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about to what degree is your leader retaining within themselves the final judgment over how your country acts, and to what degree are they going to swallow their concerns and say, well, 100 and some odd other nations all said it must be right, so it must be right. So we're simply going to do what they say, even though it's not, or we believe that it's not in the best interest of our nation. That's the difference between having a leadership that believes in your final sovereign authority to govern yourself as a nation, and a leadership who is just simply dying to hand the reins of power and thus responsibility over to someone else. Barack Obama is one of those leaders, as are most globalists. He's president of the United States, but he doesn't particularly want final responsibility for being president of the United States. He would much rather simply be the figurehead for decisions made by someone else. He wants to push as much of that over to the UN. And in the pursuit of their approval, and in the pursuit of the presumed esteem that comes from, being a good little soldier in that sort of environment, he's more than willing, or has signaled that he would be more than willing to take actions that are probably not in the United States' best interest if the UN said to do it. And that's when people talk about, you know, a president who's really just putting us under UN authority. That's what we're talking about. You know, the treaty between the United States and the UN under Barack Obama and, say, George Bush or Ronald Reagan is not significantly different, probably, in a technical sense. But in a very real sense, Ronald Reagan took the opinions of the UN under advisement. They were just sort of one more opinion among many, but he was going to make his final choices on his own. Whereas you get the impression that Obama would have takes the decisions of the UN as a final end in and of themselves. And this is sort of, you know, at the cusp of this argument about now the UN resolution on Israel. Because we have now allowed this resolution to pass, because we have allowed the UN to so strongly condemn the actions of Israel with now U.S. agreement with that, this is a clear signal to the world that the United States, at least under Barack Obama, was more than happy to subject itself to the decisions of sort of that governing body, which are overwhelmingly anti-Israel. It was Barack Obama's signal that he wanted to play nice on a sort of world leader globalist stage, and that he was going to finally bring America to heel, and we were going to stop being sort of the outliers on this, that we were just going to go with it. So that decision is interesting, and the UN authority is interesting that way. So just think that through yourself, and we're going to talk about this again. We'll talk about it in maybe a more formal way in a future video. But the thread I was reading on Facebook really touched on this idea that, you know, the Israel expansion into Palestinian territory is illegal in the sense that it may violate the wishes of the UN, and doesn't that make it wrong? And this is that idea that, no, the UN condemning something doesn't inherently make it wrong, just like the UN passing a law against something doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't do it or that it's wrong to do it. Just like the UN coming out and condemning something doesn't mean that it ought to be condemned. Or the UN praising something means it's worthy of praise. I think people, they're dying for this idea of someone to pass the buck to, of saying, well, obviously if everybody got together and voted in the UN that this is a wrong thing, then it must be a wrong thing, and that any discussion of that thing needs to start from the idea that somehow I have to justify why we're doing it when the UN told us to stop. And the answer is I have no need or requirement to justify being in conflict with the UN, because I have no reason to be in agreement with the UN. There's nothing about that body that lends itself to having my faith or I'm not complicit in their judgments. I simply have seen nothing in my entire life that leads me to believe that the UN is a body that has the best interests of those nations and those principles that I hold dear at heart. It's at best a nasty, ugly, miserable, compromised body that manages, because it gives us a forum for discussion, to avoid armed conflict under some circumstances. And for that, I suppose there's some value in it. But past that, whether the UN, everybody got together and passed an agreement that, you know, everybody in the United States should give up having a weapon and, you know, turn them over to the police. The UN could pass that resolution tomorrow. It doesn't mean I don't believe in the Second Amendment. The UN could pass an agreement tomorrow of restricting free speech. It doesn't mean that I don't think the First Amendment makes perfect sense. There are already UN resolutions that are fundamentally at odds with the United States ideas of freedom and free expression that are and the way many of us interpret the Constitution. So their condemnation of Israel means essentially nothing to me. All right, that was a little rambling, but you know what? That's part of the beauty of going live. Might gather my thoughts, ask your questions below, and I'll see if I can clarify that a little later on. Thank you for watching Herdwatching. I'm pretty sure we're going to be doing more of these live streams as 2017 continues. So make sure you like and follow the Herdwatching page as well, so you get the notifications on Facebook when I go live. As I'm doing the live streams, I have the screen right in front of me, so if you ask any questions during the stream, let me know, and I'll be able to answer them. Talk to you next time.